Our first speaker today is Andrea Gambarotto. So, Andrea is a research fellow at the UC Louvain, Belgium. His research lies at the crossroads between classical German philosophy and contemporary philosophy of science. He recently edited with Luca Edmunds a special issue of the Hegel Bulletin dedicated to Hegel and the philosophy of biology. The title of his talk today is The Genealogy of Intrinsic Propositiveness, Hegel and the Hegelian Stance. So, Andrea.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Also, I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person. I was really looking forward to the first live conference in a while, but for the circumstances could not be possible. But at least after one year and a half of being closed in our home, we are more used to this form of long distance conferencing. So hopefully it's going to work out well. So the title of the, I changed slightly the title of the conference. The title I gave, which probably represents a little bit more the content of what I'm going to say, is Intrinsic Propositiveness in Biological Systems, the Hegelian Stance and its Contemporary Relevance. And as a matter of fact, the title you have is the actual title of the paper we wrote. It's a co-author paper with Matteo Mosio, which is entitled is the title I gave for the conference originally, The Genealogy of Intrinsic Propositiveness, Hegel and the Hegelian Stance. And the paper is currently under review, so it's the first time that I present some of this material to anyone. So hopefully it makes some sense. This is the more or less, I have more or less 24 slides for 25 minutes. Hopefully we're gonna make it. So this is the general, the menu for today, which is the first part is gonna be a general introduction, which, where I'm gonna try to explain what this genealogy of intrinsic purposiveness is actually about and what it means as a term. And to a certain extent, it means an understanding or addressing what the whole project is all about. So this is the first part of the talk. The second part of the talk, it's going to be about, it's going to try to define what what we call the Hegelian stance with regard to intrinsic propositiveness. And the third part is going to try to address what we consider to be the contemporary relevance, which of this Hegelian stance, which we try to define. And this relevance concerns the relation between purposive agency and the inactive mind. So this is the general framework, and off we go. Okay, so if any one of you has ever heard one conference by me, they probably are familiar with this quote. For all the others, I introduce you to my favorite quote by J.B.S. Haldane, who was one of the father of modern population genetics in the early 20th century, and who is reported to have said several times that teleology is like a mistress to a biologist because he cannot live without her, but is unwilling to be seen with her in public. And what does this sentence mean, and why is it important for my overall project? So to frame the content of this sentence, which to a certain extent exemplifies the relation that modern biology in the 20th century, especially has had with the concept of teleology. And the way I like to think about this is also something I've been mentioning in previous talks. I think I like to think about this as a clash between, through Selarsian terms, as a clash between the manifest image and the scientific image of the organism. One in which, according to the manifest image, so the kind of relation we have with organisms in our everyday life is that it is a manifest idea that organisms are intrinsically purposive agents, purposive entities. And on the other hand, the scientific image, which comes from the major scientific consensus today, which says that this is in fact is not and cannot be the case, since the only legitimate explanation we have is mechanistic explanation. So faced with this general situation, the kind of project me and Matteo are involved in, and in which this paper is the first step is a genealogy of intrinsic propositiveness, which is a historical and theoretical research or a historical theoretical project which aims to retracing a tradition that has put forward the centrality of the intrinsic propositiveness of organisms as something that that needs to be explained scientifically and deserves to be explained scientifically. And when we just started the project, and when we were thinking about where to go first, it was me who suggested that we first, as coming from a background of classical German philosophy, that we take Hegel into consideration, because Hegel has in fact a lot of things to say, and those things to say are especially found in the sense of logic, which is in the latter part of the sense of logic, which is the topic of the conference. So before I move to the second part of the conference, another last word on the general theoretical background, of course, that grounds, to a certain extent, the project itself. So, and the theoretical background is the so-called theory of biological autonomy, which it's a term that was first formulated by Francisco Varela, who was one of the main inspiration both for me and for Matteo, with this book published in 1979 entitled The Principle of Biological Autonomy, and the further elaboration that was made by Matteo, my co-author, and Alvaro Moreno in a more recent book published in 2015 entitled Biological Autonomy. And so the general idea is the founding concept in this project is the idea of an autonomous system. So for those who are not familiar with the theory of biological autonomy, what defines an autonomous system is a system that is far from thermodynamic equilibrium, that is continually transferred by a flow of energy and matter. And what is typical for autonomous system is that an autonomous system is a system that exploits this flow of matter and energy in order to produce work that allows the system to maintain itself. And this is paradigmatically instantiated by the phenomenon of metabolism, where we get nutritive matter that the organism used to maintain itself and, as it were, keep the machine running. And so in our view, and Matteo has also a very nice paper that was published on Synthesis in 2017, which also lays a little bit the foundation for the whole project, is that this active self-maintenance is precisely what makes the system an autonomous system teleological. So this is the general project and the general theoretical background. So now I come to the the part that is more strictly related to the conference, which is the Hegelian stance, what we call the Hegelian stance on intrinsic propositiveness. And I will try to say in a few words what we mean with that concept and why we think it's important. So, of course, this is very familiar territory for most of the people who've been working on teleology-related issue, but also for most people familiar with the philosophy of nature of German idealism. You cannot talk about teleology without talking about Kant, and especially the concept of natural purposes as it's formulated in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, and most explicitly in paragraph 64 and 65, which is where the main action, in my opinion, takes place. And of course, the one first definition that Kant provide in the early part of the Critique of the teleological judgment, and most notably in paragraph 64, is that a natural purpose is a thing that exists. A thing exists as a natural purpose if it is a cause and effect of itself. What does this mean? It means that the parts of the organism exist only through their relation and through their relation with the whole and on account of the whole. And the problem, however, is that of course we could make a whole conference about this, so I'm gonna keep it short. But the main problem with Kant's account of teleology is that, by Kant's own word, this form of circular organization is not analogous with any causality that we know, and that we can think about that only with a remote analogy to our action according to ends, to rational intentional agency. So this creates, of course, a lot of epistemological problems, which are mostly exemplified by the very famous antinomy of teleological judgment. And according to the terms I set in the previous part of the conference, so the idea of a clash between scientific image and manifest image of the organism, I'd say that it's pretty it works pretty well to read the antinomy of teleological judgment precisely as such form of clash, because as it's presented in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, the antinomy of teleological judgment consists in the opposition between a thesis and an antithesis. And the thesis, which in my opinion represent the scientific image, is that all generation of material things and their forms must be judged as possible in accordance with merely mechanical laws. And the antithesis, on the other hand, which represent the manifest image, is that some products of material nature, that is organisms, cannot, or organized beings, or as Kant will say, cannot be judged as possible according to merely mechanical law. So the way Kant goes about solving this antinomy is, of course, with the idea of teleology as a regulative principle, which has a lot of problems, some of which Hegel did not fail to kind of make fun in the introduction to the teleology section in the Stance of Logic. The way I read that, there was a part where Hegel says, well, and Kant gets out of the problem by arguing that teleology and mechanism are just regulative principles, as if they will not stay in the same form of contradiction by turning them into regulative principles. And so, in a sense, what I see Hegel doing in especially in the latter part of the Sense of Logic, which is the object of the conference, is trying to moving beyond this, the Kantian conundrum concerning teleology. And the way he does that makes up what we call the Hegelian stance. So, which I think can be more or less synthesized in these three main aspects. So in order to get out of the antinomy of teleological judgment as Kant, in which Kant was to which Kant was bound, we need to, first of all, free our understanding of nature from mechanistic canons, which is more what the way I read the Sense of Logic is what happens mostly in the mechanism and the chemism sections. Then we need to abolish the Kantian dualism between reason as something which is purposive and nature as purely mechanical, or as Hegel would say, the dualism of concept and object, which in my opinion happens especially in the teleology section. And finally, on the basis of this reasoning, we should argue that the intrinsic purposiveness of reason stems in fact out of the intrinsic purposiveness of life, which is, in my reading of the Science of Logic, what happens in the life section respectively and in the cognition section. So this is the way I see the unfolding of that section of the Science of Logic as a whole. And the most important aspect of this unfolding is, of course, the relation between mechanism and teleology, or which is kind of became famous in Hegel studies as the idea that teleology is the truth of mechanism, or following the letter of the Science of Logic in the recent 2010 Cambridge translation, purposive connection has proved to be the truth of mechanism, according to Hegel. And what does it mean is that an organic entity cannot be decomposed. The result of the mechanism and chemism section is that an organic entity cannot be decomposed and explained by analyzing its parts, and must instead be conceived according to teleological principles. What does it mean? This means essentially the idea of a strong biological organism, where Hegel says, for example, always in the teleology section, no, this is in the life section, and most notably in the section on the living individual, that the organism is a manifold of, not of parts, but of members, which exist as such only in the individuality of the organism, and if separated, revert to the mechanical and chemical relation of common objectivity. I think in the same idea is expressed also in the Encyclopedia, where Hegel, following Aristotle, says that if you cut out a finger, it's not a finger anymore. It just turns out in the chemical and in the chemical process. So with this in mind, I will say that what we define as the Hegelian stance, also with an eye at its contemporary relevance already, is that the intrinsic purposiveness can be the object of natural science. This is what we extrapolate from that, and what we think is the potential meaning of the Hegelian stance for contemporary philosophy of biology. And the way we extrapolate that is that we read Hegel as arguing that intrinsic propositiveness can be the object of natural science, but only at the condition of shifting the scientific work to a different level of description, or to be more specific, instead of studying how the parts determine the whole mechanically, which is everything that for Kant, for why is teleology problematic for Kant, is precisely because for Kant, science is only the study of how parts determine wholes. And what is highly problematic for Kant is the fact that in organisms, the whole seems to be determining the parts, which is something that doesn't have any relation with any causality we know, and thus the antinomy of teleological judgment. And instead of doing that, so instead of studying how the part determines the whole mechanically, Hegel's focus is organism as whole and as intrinsically purposive agents. So to put it in another way, Hegel seems to tell us that we need to, the only reasonable thing to do there, the only thing that is in accordance to the concept, is that we should start our scientific inquiry by considering organisms as agents. You cannot decompose them. So the only thing you can do is assume that they are intrinsically purposive agent and study the effects of this intrinsic propositiveness. So this was already kind of opening, this idea is kind of opening already to the contemporary elements. It's already a very mediated version of what Hegel says, that goes already in, that is asking the question of how can we make use today of what Kant is, of what Hegel is saying. And this is the last part of the talk. I'm going to try to, which is a little bit more substantial, but I think we are still within the time frame. Concern, as I was saying at the beginning, the relation between purposive agency and the active mind. So a general overview of where the concept of agency, of the role of the concept of agency is in contemporary biology and cognitive science and philosophy thereof. So for those who are not familiar with contemporary debates in biology or philosophy of biology, biology is today a very thriving organismal biology, especially, is a thriving field of research with where a lot is happening from a theoretical point of view. And what is happening can be synthesized in three main aspects. So the first one is what is called the return of the organism, which has been advocated in a paper by Bateson in a somewhat obscure journal, in this paper from 2005 entitled The Return of the Whole Organism. Philippe Ullmann, who was my doctor fata in Paris, also has a very nice paper in History and Philosophy of the Life Sciences about the return of the organism in evolutionary biology, and more recently, Dan Nicholson in the Philosophy Compass also kind of reconstructs the landscape in a pretty effective way. And what is this return of the organism? Is the idea that we need to overcome basically the framework that has dominated our understanding of biology since Haldane, more or less. So the so-called modern evolutionary synthesis, which focuses only on genes, so sub-organismal entities, and supra-organismal entities, which are populations. So what the modern synthesis does, which is the way we have been doing biology for the last 70 years, does population genetics. And the organism, as popularized by the famous book by Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene, the organism is just a medium between the two important realms, which are the realm of the gene and the realm of populations. And recently, there's been a big debate published in Nature in 2014 by Kevin Laland and other people who are endorsing the idea of that we need to extend or revise the modern synthesis to focus much more essentially on the role of the organism with phenomena like phenotypic plasticity, evolutionary developmental biology, niche construction. I'm not going to go into that. It's not important for the conference, but there's a very thriving field that is arguing that we we need to go back to the whole organism if we are to understand how evolution works. And most recently, Dennis Walsh, who I'm a big fan of, in a very interesting book entitled Organisms, Agency and Evolution from 2015, and more metaphysically committed also in more recent papers, has been, and even Yogi Jaeger, who's also a biologist turned philosopher or theoretician, is going to publish, there's another paper is going to appear in a book edited by Matteo soon, starting to talk about an agential perspective. So we need an agential perspective on organism. We need to consider organism as agents. And a similar understanding, a similar interest in agency has characterized the emergence of the so-called embodied cognition, which has several different fields. The first one was ecological psychology that was born in the late 70s with the work of J.J. Gibson, and the idea basically that the organism, the environment is not a neutral element to the organism, but it's always presenting what he call affordances, so possibilities to act. And sensory motor theory, which is kind of similar, which is more focused on perception, is the idea that perception is not something neutral, but it's something that is connected with sensory motor contingencies of the organism, which is the most important defender of this idea is Alva Noe, who's a professor at Berkeley. And most importantly, which is something which we're going to focus especially today. So what is enactivism? So this agential perspective and activism, which was born in 1991 through the pioneering work of Francisco Varela with Ivan Thompson and Eleanor Roche in this book that is like 30 years from the publication, The Embodied Mind, and was elaborated on by Ivan Thompson, 2007 book entitled Mind in Life. And while these two perspectives are interesting, what we say is that these two perspectives are the ones that are taking what we call an Hegelian stance, which consists in anchoring agency on intrinsic propositiveness, which is not exactly the case for broader debates. So what we do in the paper is focus especially on how the Hegelian stance is at work in contemporary Varelian enactivism. And what we take this Varelian activism to be doing can be synthesized in a twofold move, which is very similar to what Hegel does in the sense of logic. And the first move is rooting agency and cognition into biological intrinsic propositiveness. That is, this means that natural agency is first and foremost a manifestation of the purposive organization of living system. A good example is the pioneering paper by Weber and Varela, Life After Kant, or 2005 paper by Di Paolo on teleology, adaptivity, and agency, also brilliant paper. And the second move of what we call the Hegelian stance in an activism maybe is presupposing the realization of a purposive organization. So we have to assume organisms as purposive agents. We cannot decompose them, and we should rather shift the focus to its condition, to what allows this purposive agency and to the effects of this purposive agency in the relation between the organism and the environment. So I prepared two examples. The one is precisely the seminal paper is the last paper published by Varela 1 year after his death in 2001 with co-author Andreas Weber. And towards the end of the paper, of course, if you come to this with Hegelian here, it's really hard not to feel a certain kindred spirit between the two approaches. So an organism is a center that organizes matter into a living being and its Umwelt, hence enacting on this stage the original split of subject and its world and their dialectical interrelatedness. Hegel talks about the original judgment of life in the sense of logic, and I think this is precisely. Of course, they don't mention Hegel because Hegel back in the 2000 was still not, especially the philosophy of nature, was not something very much in vogue. But the theoretical proximity is undeniable. And more in the monograph by Thompson, we see, Thompson says that we see the co-emergence of inside and outside of selfhood and a correlative world of environment of otherness through the generic mechanism of network closure or autonomy and its physical embodiment. So less less strong, in my opinion, but the idea is more or less the same. Hegel tries to kind of develop a very similar idea in the, as I was saying, in the section 3 of the law, the Begriffs logic, and especially in the section on life, which is divided on, as you of course know, the living individual, the life process, and the genus. So I'm not going to be focusing on the genus. I'm just going to say a couple of things about living individual and life process, and then I'm going to wrap it up. So the living individual, what we see happening in this section is what Hegel defines as a living individual is more or less what we will today define is what Hegel is aiming at is the definition of the what we call today the organizational closure of biological individuals. When he says in the living individual section, he says that this individual is in the first place life as soul, as the concept of itself fully determined within itself of initiating self-moving principle. So soul, of course, here, as many of you know, is an Aristotelian concept, which there's several sources, but especially a paper by an Italian scholar called Diana Quarantotto, who's it's focusing on the concept of soul, and or also in the Historisches Wörterbuch der Biologie by Georg Töpfer, where the concept of soul essentially defines the concept of the organization of a body. So what Hegel is saying here, that a living individual is an individual as far as it's organizationally closed, it instantiates biological organization. And since the concept is immanent in it, the purposiveness of the living being is to be grasped as inner. So this organization is precisely what makes that organization, that individual something, a theological system. And this objectivity of the living being is the organism. It is the means and instrument of purpose, fully purposive. So this is more or less the definition Kant gave of the organism. So the living individual, I will argue, it's basically Kant and Aristotle. There's not a lot new there. It's basically, yeah, there's a very nice paper by Francesca Michelini published in 2012 in Studies in History and Philosophy of Science that basically argues that as well. It says, well, Hegel in this respect is basically Kant and Aristotle combined. What is more interesting and what we take to be the most important, the more original aspect of Hegel's treatment of organism is found in the life process section, which is something that you don't find in Kant, and which the way we read that section brings us towards the so-called thermodynamic openness of organisms. The idea that the system is, of course, is organizationally closed, but it's not closed per se. It needs to be open to the environment, with an exchange of matter and energy in order to keep the machine running. So the life process begins with need. That is the truthful movement of the self-determination of the living being, by which the latter posits itself as negated. So it needs to be, the organization is not complete in itself. It's always open to a form of negation, to otherness, and thereby refers, says Hegel, itself to an other than it, to the indifferent objectivity. So to translate this idea in contemporary terms, that because of their material turnover, which happens in metabolism, biological organisms are constantly in need of assimilating external entities and of transforming them into their living constituents. And their activity is oriented towards that satisfaction of that fundamental need. And I think this idea of the thermodynamic openness, or the structural thermodynamic openness of biological systems is well represented by the concept of Tätigkeit des Mangels, or the activity of deficiency, which was, it appears in a Nuremberg fragment on mechanism, chemism, teleology, and cognition, which was and was first highlighted by Luca Letterati and also Francesca Michelini more recently. Luca Letterati emphasized this in his Italian translation of the fragment, and Francesca Michelini has kind of capitalized on that in a 2012 paper, which she also uses the term to define the specific character of biological systems according to Hegel. So what this amounts to, is another key an activist concept, which is sense making. So the idea that the organ. This is more treated more explicitly in the encyclopedia and in the philosophy of nature. So I'm a little bit going out of my way of the science of logic here, but it's important to have a little bit of an idea about this. So since the organism is structurally in need of something from the environment to keep the machine running, the action of external factors is always fundamentally mediated by the intrinsic autonomy of the system, and thus endows the system with what we might call a point of view on its milieu. There's a very brilliant paper by Georges Canguilhem on this, published in the Knowledge of Life, the living and its milieu, which more or less argues something similar to this. And in the sense of logic, this is in the encyclopedia, Hegel argues that an important advance in the true conception of the organism has been made by changing determination and replacing the action of external causes by stimulation through external potencies. So it's not like a physical system where you just have causation from one element to the other, but since the causation is always mediated by the relation to the environment is always mediated by the autonomy of the system, is always what counts as an environment, what counts as a milieu is always mediated by the organism. And this is, I think, very nicely expressed in a paper by Ivan Thompson, where he says that when you think about a bacterium swimming in a sucrose gradient, which is a typical example of all in activist literature, it's literally everywhere. And Thompson says that sucrose is a nutrient, is not an intrinsic feature of the structure of the sucrose molecule. It's a relational feature linked to the bacteria's metabolism, and sucrose, in this sense, as significance of value or value as food, but only in the milieu that the organism itself brings into existence. So the fact that sucrose as value or as significant as food is always related to the organism. Without the organism, you have no value and you have no meaning. One last slide before I wrap it up. This is not necessarily related, but it's to the sense of logic. But this is a concept that we find in the encyclopedia, but it's an absolutely extraordinary concept we don't find anywhere else after a certain time, and the concept is the concept of Krustrib. And the concept of Krustrib tends to say that organisms not only bring forth or enact an environment from a cognitive point of view that is connected to their vital needs, but also do so materially. So in a dictionary from the early 19th century, the definition of Krustrib is that in the case of animals, their inherent ability to produce certain composite effects similar to human art, a kind of natural instinct. And a Hegelian example of this is in the addition to paragraph 365, where it says that the instinct, it tries to exemplify what the Krustrib is, and what the Krustrib, why I think it's important because it really brings forth the idea of organisms as agents in a very explicit way. And when Hegel is trying to explain to us what, or to his students, what it means is, it says that he take the example of the instinctive building of nests, burrows, and layers, whereby the general totality of the animal surroundings is its own. Then there is the migration of birds and fish, which is related to their climatic sensitivity, and also the collecting of provision for the winter, whereby that which is to be consumed later by the animal becomes part of its present habitat. And this is arguably, in my opinion at least, the most contemporary translation of the concept of Krustrib is the concept of niche construction, as it was formulated by Alding Smeh, Kevin Laland, and Marcus Feldman in the 2003 pioneering work, niche construction, the forgotten process of evolution, which is one of the main actors. Niche construction theory is one of the main actors in what I define as the extended evolutionary synthesis and the endeavor to bypass the way we've been thinking about evolution for the last 70 years. So take home message, I hope that I'm still on time. So Hegel's treatment of biological purposiveness does belong in a genealogy of intrinsic purposiveness, that is, in a tradition that considers intrinsic propositiveness as a concept that needs to be developed theoretically and that deserve scientific treatment, which is not the case for most mainstream biology. Hegel adopts Kant's understanding of intrinsic propositiveness and but especially emphasizes the capacity of organisms to maintain their form in spite, or we will say today, thanks to a continuous material turnover. So in that sense, what we define as the Hegelian stance vis-a-vis intrinsic propositiveness consists essentially in assuming purposive agency as a feature of organism and elaborating on their interacting abilities. So assuming that as a fact and build theory on the base of this assumption. And what we try to show in the paper, I've been trying to convince you in this talk, is that such Hegelian stance is specifically at work today in an activist approaches to agency and cognition. So I hope it was still on time. Thank you very much for the attention.
So I'm pleased to present my friend and colleague, Edmund. Edmund is a PhD candidate within the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. Edmund is also an ordinand within the Church of England. He has been accepted for training at the College of the Resurrection at Mirfield, where he will train for ordained ministry within the Church of England. Today he will be speaking to us about Hegelian Christology and the theological subtext of the doctrine of the concept. The title of his paper is Christianity through the Science of Logic. So let's welcome.
Thank you. I'll aim to go for about 20 minutes, shall I?
Okay.
This is about reasonable. So, thank you for being with me. It's good to be here with you, and it's good to have this opportunity to speak to you. As my good friend Philip has said, I have something of a theological interest. In fact, you might say it's driven me to make some fairly firm lifestyle choices. And this is, in no small part, coming out of my background as a Hegel scholar. And so it's in that aspect that I'm talking to you today. If it can get me to make such a, say, a radical change in form of life, I must think there's some substance to it. And the church thinks so as well. In their assessments of me, Hegel came up quite a lot. That's in itself a source of curiosity. Why are they so interested? Well, they're interested because at the moment we're in the market for a better, all-inclusive account of what kind of world we find ourselves in, what kinds of beings humans are, and what difference the Christic event, the ministry, crucifixion, death, resurrection of Jesus makes to what it is to be a human. And we're in the market for this because the background is a sort of default assumption of an account that is easy to teach, convenient, and wrong. And that account is penal substitution. Effectively, the idea is that whenever someone errs or transgresses, and so it is said we transgress daily, even hourly, we incur a sort of debt before the divine justice of the Father. Well, we've accrued quite a bit of debt, more than anybody is going to be paying off. It's an arbitrarily large finite amount. Well, the only thing that is higher in value than an arbitrarily large finite debt is an infinite price. There's only one thing of infinite value, so it's said, God himself. Thus the crucifixion. One debt is paid by a larger offering, the Son. Penal substitution then, the substitution of Christ in for our punishment. This theory isn't very good. For one, it sort of starts on the assumption that sin is like a divine Excel spreadsheet, and it's got lots of numbers down the side, and all that happens with the cross is the Father sets all the numbers to 0. It doesn't actually do anything to humans at all. In fact, there's no reason the crucifixion couldn't have happened in heaven on this theory. We didn't need to know about it. And another problem is more scriptural. It kind of assumes the Father is the judge. Canonically, it is the Son who's the judge. Hegel's substitution then. We don't like it and we want something better. And that is where Hegel comes in. We all secretly suspect that Hegel is something of a Christian mystic. We look at those references to the turbulent philosophy of Burma in the Doctrine of Being. And there have been various books written about it. One of the more famous ones, I bought a copy if you've never seen it, is Glenn McGee's Hegel and Hermeticism, which is a perfectly workmanly book. It sort of enumerates the various traditions that Hegel might have had some kind of involvement in, describes what they were, if there's any evidence that he was involved in them, it gives them, and that's the end of the matter. There is no account of Hegelian mysticism. There's a suspicion there's something there. So with now 15 to 20 minutes left, we're going to make a go of it. We're going to see what we can do. And the first question we have to begin with, to get any account that is decent, that is a larger systematic theology, rather than just a local answer to a question, we have to ask, what kind of world is it that we find ourselves in? And Hegel's answer is at least simple on the face of it. The world we find ourselves in is a network assembly of concepts in motion. Those concepts come in many flavors, of course. Those we encounter in the doctrines of being and essence, we tend to refer to as categories. Those we go on to and encounter in the nature aren't categories in the sense that we are directly acquainted with their self-development. We always infer how they self-develop through our acquaintance with sensuous nature, and they're different in other ways. We suspect them to be composite structures of concepts made out of other concepts. In just the same way that you might think about certain syllogisms as being judgments made out of other judgments. You can get categories to do that, and that's, I think, how we get up to a concrete, sensible being. And this is scripturally compliant, maybe alarmingly. We've not just got, the Gospel of, following to the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and we've not just got the account in Genesis, the way in which the world is spoken into existence, or the specific dignity given to the way Adam names the animals. We also have my very favorite piece of scripture. It's a snippet from Isaiah 55. It's the canticle on Wednesdays. As the rain and the snow come down from above, but return not again till they have watered the earth, so does my word go forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish that which I purpose, and will succeed in the task for which I sent it. You can see there Isaiah, writing in a very different context to those other texts, maintains that the creative agency of God is expressed primarily in the form of words. And that Hebrew word used in Isaiah is dabar. It's a word that shares its root with the root for things, events, situations, matters. It can just as easily flip from being a word about disputation or dictation through to being a word about concrete states of affairs. I think Isaiah knows what he's saying, bluntly. And on the basis of that, I'm going to say that, okay, we can go along with this. This is a viable contender for a theology. But we need to put some flesh on these bones. What does it mean to be in a world that is an interlocking network of concepts? We need to know something about what concepts are. And Hegel does tell us, his prerogative in that long introduction to the doctrine of the concept is primarily to tell us about the concept, with a definite article on the front. But he does talk about concepts. And the long and short of it is, in a very limited sense, Random is essentially right. Concepts are well described as the sum total of the differences they make to other concepts to which they are related. There is a very good snippet quote for this. Just here we are. God, as living God, and better still, as absolute spirit, is only recognized in what he does. Humankind were directed early to recognize God in his works. Only from these can the determinations proceed that can be called his properties, and in which his being is also contained. That's Hegel saying that God, considered as concept, cashes out in the differences he makes. The works express the properties, no works, then no being. The being of the concept is intertwined to the point of dependency with the differences it makes, in the case of God, with his relationship with humanity. So we've got our minimal account, we know what kind of world we're in. Now we need to think about why humans. And here's where I'm going to have to diverge a little bit from Hegel. Because Hegel has a very simple, at least to some extent, explanation. We start with being pure being, and if he is to be believed that there is indeed an unbroken chain of immanent self-development, never once smuggling in implicit assumptions in this edition just shy of 800 pages, we get all the way through to the closure of the system, the jump over into nature, and we continue the same system by another means until we get to humans. So there is no need in this system for an external God who needs to be located as metaphorically distinct from the other elements of the world. And those caveats are important. But let's imagine such a figure, or work with that language for a moment, because we need to put some flesh on this theory. Might work for Hegel, it's not going to work as a theology. My proposal is that we ask, why did God not create more angels rather than humans? Angels, spectral, at least some of them, Pseudo-Dionysus is accepted. Very shiny, got wings, flapping around the road. I mean, they seem great. Why not more of them? There was a specific agenda in making humans rather than something else. And that specific agenda, I put to you, is that God intended to create beings that could participate in his own glory in the same way that he himself participates in it. That is to say, the objective of making humans was theosis, the becoming divine of those same humans. This sounds like it should be heresy. It is in fact completely standard teaching. Just as evidence, in the Office of Morning Prayer for Ascension Day, it is instructed and required to pray the line, may Christ, who has reopened the kingdom of heaven, bring us to reign with him in glory. We are asked, and indeed, at least for ordained ministers, required to pray that we be brought to reign with him in glory. That theosis thing feels like heresy agnosticism. It isn't. If that is the objective, that's the point of the exercise, making beings that can participate in his own glory in the same way he himself does, then he needed beings that had wills of their own. Angels, shiny, basically robots. And thus, free will. So part of using this pseudo-Hegelian, loosely based off the structure of subjectivity and objectivity and how we get to the idea, makes the need for free will a core part of the package. And here we invoke a Hegelian principle, a standard issue Hegelian principle. A potency is not a potency if it is not at some point, somewhere, actualized. A standard example I would give is, suppose I've become an artist working in a dusty garret in the midst of nowhere, and I've done so for multiple decades, and I tell everybody I meet, I am a great artist, I am wonderful. My masterpiece is coming just next year. I do so for several decades and then die. I was not, in fact, a great artist. I was some fool who locked himself in a garret. I'm afraid that coming up with the goods is a requirement for me having had a potency earlier in time. Whether that potency really existed previously depends on whether it's later actualized. And I think we can find that very clearly in actuality. So free will, to be free will, to be a potency to exercise the will, has to be used. It can't go unused. Now, if humans are created in a context of direct acquaintance with God, with the fount of all goodness, there's no doubt about what they should do in every time and place. So there's only really one exercise of the will, which is to distance themselves from that. That initial negation, which comes to us in Scripture as the fall. That's the only possible exercise of the will in that initial starting point. So it's a core part of the account. Again, scripturally compliant. Why is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil right in the middle of the garden with no defenses around it and humans made right next to it? Of course, they're supposed to eat from it. I mean, there's no dodging, but that's the whole point of the allegory. And so we are out distanced from God. That is the fall. But there is a catch, a much bigger catch. If, as I put to you, God is the fount of all goodness, all being, all life, all potency to act, all capacity to make substantive difference that goes beyond the bare prerequisites of objectivity, then the capacity to return to that initial state is lost to us. Having rejected the power to do the thing, we no longer have the means within ourselves to do that. Thus, this broadly Hegelian account, in which I would want to patch the event of the fall onto the development out of syllogism into mechanism, requires not that we work our way back, but that God, the concept in Hegel's tongue, come to us or be born within the objective. Thus, the historical Christ. Historical Christ was killed by the nativity, not by the cross. That is to say, in becoming fully mortal, becoming fully finite, embracing all the limitation and confusion of being human. And it's not just an anatomical becoming human, it's an epistemic one as well. At times he seems not to know certain things, because humans don't know everything. It's an embrace into the fullness of human finitude. The nativity kills Jesus. So God dies as human and remains as human. Even post-resurrection, even if we speak about Christ who sits at the right hand of the Father, still human, never stopped being human. And this means that the fullness of the divine nature came to humanity and died with humanity, never zoomed back up, which is really weird for the Bible, because I've got no end of Old Testament prophets who zoom straight back up in fiery chariots. He's an outlier, and it's an outlier because it's necessary. Thus we get to Hegel's account of the resurrection rolled together with Pentecost. The resurrection's real character is not that the Father sits outside and makes a special case for Jesus and flips him from dead to life, but that the death of God as human changes the nature of death, the condition of impotency, to a condition of life, a condition of potency. The empirical resurrection of Christ is more an outward sign for our convenience knowledge of this. It's Pentecost is the meat on the bone. So, I've got a few minutes left, so I'll just flesh this out a little bit. I think this is a pretty good contender. It's got some issues. For one, it creates a theology in which God very clearly, foreknowingly, creates a world in which the preconditions for the abhorrent evil that we do encounter to come to be. Even if we do some fiddling around with the privation theory and say, well, it didn't really cause it, it's just an absence. No, it was foreknowable. With a few minutes before I go, I'll just fill out one detail I didn't mention. If we want to use the doctrine of the concept as the internal scaffold for this, there are a few things we can draw. For one, Hegel gives us a really good summary of how the idea comes to be from out of external purposiveness in the section between the means, which is that penultimate section of the teleology chapter, And then if you hold that in mind, you remember that when you get over to the introduction to the idea. And I'm thinking in the De Giovanni, that's pages 678 to 679, that sort of region. Hegel's version is that internal purposiveness comes out of external purposiveness because the universal purpose that was to be implemented in external teleology becomes the middle term, is represented in the middle terms of each line of the syllogism. So if you have an IUP universal purpose, your means will be particular, and in the case of initial internal purposiveness, that becomes UPI, and then your end, say the house you've built with the tools that were your means and the blueprint that was your purpose, becomes PIU. You can see that the middle term of each line is UPI. You get a really nice cruciform structure in that the middle term spells the same as the means. I think it's just a joke on Hegel's part, but he comes back to the idea of objectivity reforms within itself the concept that first invented to give rise to it. This is one of these bits that I'm using as the underlying engine. Obviously, I'm not straight copying Hegel. I'd say, well, here's one line of Hegel, here's the corresponding line of scripture. But it's what I wanted to share with you today, that we can get something fairly decent out of this in a way that is better than the competing theories. I think that's a good point to stop. Thank you. Shall I take a perch here whilst we do our Q&A?
Yes. Okay. Right. So,
So I've got a question for both speakers. I'll start with Andrea, and it's really just to ask you to clarify what exactly it means to say that an organism has agency, or that internal purposiveness is an expression of agency in the organism.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's a terrific question. I think it's a hard question, but it's a very good question. So let me think. The way I would try to define agency in that sense is that, for example, a classical understanding of biological system, which for example, in the field of Hegel studies, we find, or more or less Hegel studies, we find in, for example, in McDowell, in Mind the World, McDowell, Mind the World is a terrific book, but he tends to have like this very, very strong distinction between Sellarsian distinction between the realm of law, which is dominated essentially by mechanism, and the space of reasons, which is the space of full-fledged subjectivity dominated by meaning, language, intersubjectivity. McDowell in the introduction to Mind the World says that the space of reasons is the realm of freedom. It's one of the rare moments where McDowell leave himself to a more classical formulation. And in recent work I'm working on, which is not necessarily related to Hegel, but to a certain extent it is, what me and another co-author charge McDowell with is the idea, and by the way, it's something Uber-Dreyfus charged McDowell with again, also in 2005, sparking the very famous, very strong debate between the two of them, is the idea that what we charge McDowell with is a fundamentally mechanistic understanding of biological nature, and at least a pseudo-behavioristic understanding of animal cognition, where behaviorism is the idea that basically organisms are sort of machines or like computer program that have an algorithm which has been written by the blind watchmaker of natural selection, which make it so that with a certain input, the organism needs to act in a certain way. And the whole of the enactivist literature, and especially the example of the bacterium, which I was mentioning during the talk. For example, Stuart Kaufman in this 2000 book Investigation, it says when we look at the bacterium swimming in a sucrose gradient, we ask the question, what is it doing? And the only the answer will be, the correct answer will be, is going to get dinner, in the sense that there is a form, the concept of agency, to try to define in a more philosophical term for an activist literature. So when it comes to more embodied cognition, is connected to a form of normativity. This is also a very big philosophical debate about the place of normativity in nature. And a norm is something that you ought to do. And if you don't do that, you're contravening to a norm. And an organism ought to, for example, in the case of the bacterium, go towards more sucrose, because sucrose is good for the maintenance of the system, and avoid poisonous substances, because that's detrimental to the system, to the maintenance of the system. And to a certain extent, so the assuming that there is a form of normativity for the system, if you assume that, you can also not assume that and be a straightforward naturalist with a mechanist reductionist agenda. But if you do assume that there are forms of norm in nature, then you are necessarily assuming that there is a form of agency, and also because it's something that could go wrong, that the organism could do that, could also do something else, and one thing will be good for the self-maintenance, so it's intrinsically good, and one thing is intrinsically bad. So it's in a broader framework is the idea of grounding norms in nature to a certain extent. I hope it worked. Hope it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you. And if I could ask a follow-up? No.
No, not really. We're very short on time, so
thank you very much.
And press on. But did you have a question, Frederick?
I did, yeah. I've often been quite interested in the transition from syllogism to objectivity. And you briefly alluded to that.
Okay.
And there's a very long discussion in objectivity about ontological proofs as well. I was wondering what you thought about that, given your approach to logic.
No one ever has or will be convinced of the existence of God by means of any of the classical arguments. That's not how it works, and it never has. Hegel knows this. If we combine that text with the manuscript, which is a manuscript in Hegel's own hand, it's not student lecture notes, of the, at his time of his death, unpublished lecture on the proofs of the existence of God, we see he mobilizes the arguments to do functionally what I've been doing with the background, the categories in the back of my head today. He treats some of them as concerning the transition from thought to being, and some of them as concerning the transition from being to thought. So, for example, the ontological argument begins with the thought of a being and proceeds to the actual being. Conversely, the cosmological argument begins with concrete sensible being and goes to a thought. That's the way he plays with it there. I have to say, those lectures were less insightful to me than the more veiled stuff in the science of logic. The version of the science of logic is, it tells you it's not giving the game away on a first reading, and it's probably not intended to. He may not have even known it was applicable in that way, but it's got the toolkits for decent theology in it.
Thank you.
Also, Burma's a distraction, don't touch him.
Right, our next question comes from Karen.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, actually, I also have a question for both of them.
Okay.
So, yeah, I hope I can. Okay, so first, thanks a lot, Andrea, for your talk. I know my question is like kind of a really big question, but yeah, I was just wondering what you think, because I was wondering, what do you think, how does Hegel solve the Kantian antinomy? Because you said, you said something like Hegel claims that intrinsic propositiveness can be the object of natural science as a condition of shifting to a different level of description. And actually, a Kantian scientist can do the same. I mean, I would even say Kant claims that she shifts perspective like the whole time, because like given that teleological principles are heuristic principles in order to find like more mechanisms in organisms. So I was wondering, yeah, what do you think? In which way does Hegel resolve the antinomy?
Okay, thank you. Also, very, very substantial question. So I'm going to try, also considering that we are a little bit short on time, I will try to, I will give a short answer to a tough question. How does Hegel solve the Kantian antinomy? So the short answer would be, well, he does that by arguing that the teleology is the truth of mechanism. That is that purposive connection, as it says in the Science Logic, is what is the more essential aspect of that form of causality. So for Kant, the antinomy is the antinomy between mechanism and teleology. Hegel, and this is where we take our Hegelian stance towards the contemporary debate. Hegel decides that the dichotomy in favor of teleology. Of course, this is not saying much, because this is work that I'm still doing. As a matter of fact, I'm working with Edgar Maraguat to a paper that tries to understand what it means that teleology is the truth of mechanism. But so the short answer for a work that is not completely done yet is in favor of teleology. And the relation with the contemporary stuff is that if Hegel solves that the dichotomy in favor of teleology, the contemporary version is to say, well, we don't have to provide an account. And there are some scientists that do that, that say, well, we don't have to provide an account of how parts are turned into a self-organizing teleological, so give as it were a mechanistic account of how teleology emerges out of the non-teleological realm. And Hegel says, well, the only thing you have, if you want to understand living beings, which are the instantiation of the concept, is teleology. So you need to assume those as assume biological systems as per se teleological without trying to decompose them.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yes. The other question, yeah, so thanks also for the talk. You said, why did God create humans and not angels? And you said something like, okay, because they have to participate in the same glory and in the same way God himself does.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what kind of argument that exactly is, because it seems to be a logical argument somehow. But
yes.
Actually, yeah,
I see where you're going with this.
The only thing he actually needs to create are finite beings with free will and the capacity to think. But that doesn't mean that they're not humans. It's just an empirical fact that we know just humans.
Yeah, I mean, there's no clear mandate for lungs specifically as how to do the respiration. Whatever people into Kabbalah might say. Here again, I do wonder whether there would be, I don't think there might be no harm whatsoever in saying that the rest is explained by perfectly ordinary natural developmental processes. There seems to be no objection to that. I think we may as well scratch Hegel's quasi-rejection of evolution from the nature and just say at some point we'll get around to rewriting the nature and we'll come up there with a perfectly natural account. No issue there. For me, I should say the real coalface, the real challenge is, okay, we've got an account of Christology that tells us how we're going to have this grace that lets us attain the purpose for which we were created. Great. I'm actually not noticing many people who've got their wings and halos. Tellingly, we do encounter theosis. It happens in shocking, transgressive acts of mercy, in good acts that come from nowhere, that you just don't see coming. But especially in terms of forgiveness, forgiveness is politically dangerous. It's far more likely to topple certain regimes than outward military force. That is, I think, really why they had to kill John the Baptist. The guy had to die for, I think, that reason. It doesn't look very flashy, though. And what does look very flashy is the titanic quantity of suffering we're acquainted with. The real coalface is not, is there a God, but is this theosis truly worth the gargantuan quantities of suffering with which we are acquainted every day? That's the real Achilles heel, I think.
Thanks.
Okay, our last question for this session goes to Andrew Cooper.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Edmund and Andrea, for great papers. It's a question for Andrea. Thank you for this great account of the Hegelian stance. I think it's a very fascinating project. I look forward to seeing how it unfolds. Just wanted to ask one thing about genealogy, and I was fascinated by the way this functioned in your argument. So I just wanted to ask you to say a bit more. So I'm just wondering if overall your argument is a kind of diagnostic that folks like Dennis Walsh, who are arguing for an agentive position, actually kind of are adopting a Hegelian stance, and you're merely pointing that out? Or are you more kind of proposing that they ought to, or that a Hegelian stance would lead to kind of theoretical advantages? Or is it somewhere in between those two? So could you say a bit more about the genealogical aspect?
Oh, thank you. Nice to, by the way, nice to chat with you again. It's a very nice question. So I will say neither nor. So the project, which is this paper, is the first paper of a series of papers we want to write, and the genealogy is not about Hegel. Hegel will be one chapter. The next chapter will be about Kant. Then probably will be something on, of course, something on Aristotle. And so the idea of a genealogy of, Matteo's idea was the genealogy of intrinsic propositiveness is the title of the project. And then the subtitles is going to change as long as we go along the road. Is the idea that, so in this paper, we take Hegel into account. And the next paper, we take Kant into account. The idea is then, ideally, then to write a book which should build, I think the idea of a genealogy of intrinsic propositiveness comes from Matteo, and I think the idea of the project is to build a pedigree for the theory of biological autonomy to a certain extent, an historical pedigree. So the idea is, as I was trying to explain in the first in the introductory remarks, the status of teleology in contemporary biology is largely the one emphasized by Haldane's motto. So this idea that teleology is everywhere, but we cannot really talk about it because it's taboo to a certain extent. And the majority position, which is, for example, Ernst Mayr, the concept of teleonomy, all these so-called theological account of biological functions, or Millikan account of language, is the idea that, well, we don't have the problem of Eldon anymore because we have, or Michael Roos is very strongly on this, says many times that, well, we don't have the problem anymore because we have natural selection solves the problem. No big deal. And what we want to do is, well, there is a minor canon, a tradition which is not reconstructed, not taken into account very much in mainstream philosophy of biology, that has said, well, no, organisms are intrinsically purposive entities, and we need to build a theory for that. And of course, today, Hegel is of course, one big part of that project, but there's Kant, there's Bergson, there's Aristotle, and the idea is basically building how this tradition has unfolded throughout the centuries to basically build a pedigree for the theory of biological autonomy.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
All right. Thank you all. And let us thank once more our speakers, Andrea and Edmund. A small break, about 7 to 10 minutes, thereabouts. And yeah, so let's everybody get some coffee and relax a little bit. We'll be back in a short while. Thank you all.